The Justice Department appears to be taking a pretty big step back when it comes to police reform. Attorney General Jeff Sessions sent a memo to U.S. attorneys that reads, quote, "It's not the responsibility of the federal government to manage non-federal law enforcement agencies."
Sessions has ordered a review of reform agreements made with troubled police departments. Paula Reid is tracking the developments here and joins us now. So, Paula, what's the immediate impact of this move by Sessions, especially in cities like Chicago and Baltimore?
Well, let's start with Baltimore. In the city of Baltimore, the city and the Department of Justice have reached an agreement in principle on how to reform the city's embattled police department. On Thursday, we're expected to have a hearing where the public could weigh in on that. So far, about 50 groups and individuals have submitted written comments, their thoughts on this agreement and what they think is important. But now the new Department of Justice has asked for a 90-day delay on that hearing. It's not uncommon to ask for delays in judicial proceedings, but people who worked on this agreement, they tell me they find this very alarming, and they are concerned that this is a signal that the new Attorney General does not intend to follow through with these reforms. You also asked about Chicago. In that city, they're not as far along in the process. One of the last things the Obama Justice Department did was issue a report on that city's police department detailing unconstitutional policing practices that have been happening for decades. But they don't have any sort of agreement. And Attorney General Sessions was asked about this repeatedly in his confirmation hearing, whether or not he intended to pursue reform in that city, and he was non-committal. We asked him several weeks ago whether or not he had read that report. He said he had not, but he had read a summary and found it anecdotal.
You know, you mentioned Baltimore. If I recall the report on the Baltimore Police Department, one of the conclusions was that people's rights were regularly violated by officers. What does this mean for civil rights reform?
Well, this is one of the first big signs that the new Department of Justice, the new administration, intends to roll back a lot of the reforms that were a priority for the Obama administration. The Obama administration opened a record number of civil rights investigations into police departments across the country, but Attorney General Sessions has consistently testified he does not prefer that method of reform. He does not support sort of federally enforced reforms on local law enforcement. He testified that instead he prefers collaborative reform. But in this memo, it also calls for a review of those so-called collaborative reform efforts. That just means that a police department comes to the Department of Justice and asks for help, asks for additional training, additional resources. They sort of work together to reform a police department, as opposed to what we saw in Ferguson and Chicago, where the feds came in and dictated what needed to be reformed. So even though he says he supports collaborative reform, that's also being reviewed pursuant to this memo.
So, Paula, how are local law enforcement leaders reacting about this?
Well, in Baltimore, they've said, the mayor, the police, they've all said that they want to follow through with this agreement. They say we all recognize the need for this kind of reform. And the other thing is, in talking to rank and file law enforcement over the past several years as we've watched these events in Ferguson, Chicago, Baltimore, yes, nobody wants their police department to be the subject of a pattern and practice investigation. But the fact is that a lot of times it takes the federal government coming in order to fix some of these systemic problems. This also comes with a lot of training and requirements for local governments to fork over the money to get law enforcement officers a lot of the resources that they need and haven't been given.
You know, the thing about this, like you mentioned, is it certainly represents a sharp break from the Obama administration, which really viewed reforms as essential following a number of racially charged incidents. Some of these reforms in some police departments are just getting underway. They're in midstream. Some investigations are still in midstream. Why such a dramatic change now?
It's a philosophical difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. When you were the Attorney General, you are the nation's top law enforcement official. And many people felt, rank and file officers felt, with Attorney General Eric Holder, he was the Attorney General during the events in Ferguson, many people criticized him as not being supportive enough of law enforcement during that time. People have told me that they believe he tipped his hand too many times in support of Michael Brown and his family and the protesters. And remember, the officer in that case, he was not charged. Yes, they found a pattern and a practice of civil rights violation in that police department, but many people felt that Eric Holder was not being supportive enough of law enforcement officers who put their lives on the line every day. When Loretta Lynch came into office, one of her top priorities was trying to bridge that relationship, sort of bridge the gap, fix the trust that had been broken. She made a tour of the country trying to highlight police departments that had issues, were able to fix them on their own, highlight the good work they were doing. But the fact is, while I was covering that tour, it was clear that her involvement in the Hillary Clinton email investigation overshadowed a lot of that work, and she really wasn't able to restore completely that trust between the Department of Justice and the nation's top law enforcement official and rank and file law enforcement. So it seems that's what Attorney General Sessions is trying to do. He is trying to support law enforcement, but his idea of doing that is to pull back federal resources, federal oversight, and federal investigations. But a lot of people believe the only way law enforcement can get some of the support, some of the resources that they need is when the feds step in.
Paula Reid with some very important reporting. Thank you, Paula. We appreciate it.